20 of England's most celebrated physicians had exhausted every remedy, every theory, and every prayer. The Duke's only heir was slipping away, his fever raging for 8 torture-filled days, while the most learned men in the empire stood defeated. Then a scullery maid, a nobody, invisible, barely 22, stepped out of the shadows with a steaming cup. In mere minutes, the Viscount's fever broke. The doctors were stunned. But the Duke did not offer thanks. He saw sorcery. What he did next would stain the stones of Grimsway Hall forever. If you're already leaning in, welcome. My nephew swears that if this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, he'll finally stop hiding my reading glasses. Help me win that bet. Drop a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Loveday Chenoweth had spent 4 years below stairs at Grimsway Hall, her hands red and cracked from caustic soda and scalding water. She moved through the vast Yorkshire manor like a ghost, unseen by the family who owned her labor, yet silently observing the terrifying rhythms of their lives. The Duke of Grimsway's household operated under a rule of iron tradition, and Loveday had learned early that a scullery maid's survival depended on invisibility and the suppression of her own voice. The hall itself was a fortress of aristocratic pride, its dark stone corridors chilling the blood as much as the northern winds outside. 50 rooms loomed over the moors, each more imposing than the last. Loveday's domain was the scullery and the slop sinks, though occasionally she was forced to carry heavy pails past the velvet-draped family wings. She had only ever seen the Duke, Reginald Hawthorne, from a fearful distance, a towering figure with silver-streaked hair and icy eyes that could freeze a servant mid-curtsy. He was a man ruled by rigid beliefs and a terror of scandal, his word absolute law within the estate walls. But it was his son, Viscount Rupert Hawthorne, who now held the household in a grip of despair. At 29, he was the golden future of the line, dark-haired, sharply handsome even in his sickness, and destined to inherit the title and the power that came with it. Loveday had seen him only fleetingly, a distant figure of kindness who never looked down on the staff. He was betrothed to a woman of high standing, a match that promised to unite 2 great fortunes until the fever struck and threatened to turn a wedding into a funeral. The scullery of Grimsway Hall was a place where daylight came to die, filtered through grime-streaked windows high above the stone sinks. For Loveday Chenoweth, life was measured in the rhythm of the scrubbing brush and the stinging bite of lye soap. Her hands, red and swollen, plunged repeatedly into water that was never quite warm enough to cut the grease, but always hot enough to scald. She was the lowest of the low, a creature of the basement shadows, expected to be as silent as the copper pans she polished until her reflection looked back, warped and weary. Yet, while her body labored in the damp Yorkshire gloom, her mind often drifted south to the cliffs of Cornwall and the hushed voice of her grandmother. It was there, amidst sea spray and wind, that she had learned the secrets of the earth, secrets that the high-born ignored at their peril. She remembered the old woman peeling strips of white willow bark, her gnarled fingers working with reverence. "The fever breaker," her grandmother would whisper. "The bitter spirit within the wood cools the blood when the body burns." Loveday knew now what the physicians did not, that the willow held salicin, a natural power capable of dousing the fires of sickness long before modern chemistry would bottle it as aspirin. But in this house, such knowledge was dangerous. It smacked of the old ways, of things the Duke called heathen. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from rigid order to suffocating panic 3 weeks ago. Viscount Rupert, the golden son, had collapsed during a hunt, shivering violently beneath his velvet coat. Since then, the house had held its breath. The Duke of Grimsway prowled the corridors like a wounded lion, his silver-streaked hair disheveled, his icy composure fracturing with every hour his son failed to wake. He had summoned doctors from London, grave men in black coats who arrived with leeches and laudanum, their confident voices slowly fading into murmurs of defeat. Loveday had been sent up from the depths to scrub the corridor outside the Viscount's chamber, a task usually reserved for the upper maids, but the household was in such disarray that all hands were summoned. As she scrubbed the limestone flags, the heavy oak door creaked open. The scent of sickness and stale incense drifted out. "There is nothing more, Your Grace," a physician's voice intoned, heavy with professional resignation. "The fever has consumed him. He will not last the night." The Duke's silence was more terrifying than a scream. Loveday kept her head down, scrubbing a spot that was already clean, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the weight of the strip of dried willow bark hidden deep within the pocket of her apron. She had carried it for days, a talisman of hope she was too terrified to offer. But as the door clicked shut, sealing the air inside with his death, a question burned hotter than the lie on her skin. Could she really stay silent and scrub the floor while a man died just feet away? By the morning of the 8th day, the silence in Grimsway Hall was heavier than the stone walls themselves. The grand gravel drive, usually pristine, was churned by the wheels of departing carriages. 20 of England's finest physicians, men with knighthoods and hollow promises, were retreating to London, leaving behind a father turned to stone and a son whose breathing had become a terrifying wet rattle. The verdict was unanimous and absolute. The Viscount would not see another sunrise. Down in the scullery, the air was thick with the steam of boiling laundry, but Loveday felt cold to her bones. She stood over a small copper kettle, her hand trembling as she clutched the precious shavings of willow bark. For 7 days, fear had paralyzed her. It was not just the fear of speaking out of turn, it was a deeper ancestral dread. She closed her eyes and saw the cliffs of Cornwall, smelled the salt air, and heard the crackle of the fire that had consumed her grandmother. The old woman had been a healer, a wise woman beloved by the village until the crops failed and the mood turned. They had burned her for the very cures that had once saved them. The Duke was a man of the same cloth as those villagers, pious, proud, and terrified of the unseen. To offer him a cure from a servant's apron rooted in the old ways was to invite the accusation of witchcraft. Loveday knew this. She knew that saving Rupert might well mean damning herself. But as the grandfather clock in the hall tolled the hour, echoing like a funeral bell, her conscience broke the deadlock of her fear. She could not let a man die for the sake of her own safety. With shaking fingers, she dropped the dried bark into a chipped porcelain cup and poured the boiling water. The infusion turned a pale, unpromising amber, releasing a sharp, bitter scent, the smell of the riverbank, of earth and life. There were no incantations, no magic, just the simple truth of the willow. She wrapped a rough linen cloth around the cup to keep it warm and stepped away from the safety of the sinks. The climb up the servants' stairs felt like an ascent to the gallows. Pushing open the green baize door that separated the workers from the masters, she stepped onto the plush carpets of the family wing. The silence here was absolute. Her heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a scullery maid, a ghost, trespassing in the sanctuary of the dying. As the door to the Viscount's chamber loomed ahead, guarded by shadows, she gripped the cup tighter. Would they even let her pass, or would she be thrown out before she could pour a single drop? The air inside the sick room was thick and stagnant, smelling of beeswax, stale sweat, and the cloying sweetness of hothouse lilies brought in to mask the scent of death. Loveday slipped through the heavy oak door, the porcelain cup trembling slightly in her hands. The only guardian of the heir's bedside was Martha, a young chambermaid whose eyes were swollen red from weeping. The physicians had retreated to the library to drink brandy and draft the death announcement. The Duke was pacing the corridor outside, unable to watch the final candle flicker out. "Martha," Loveday whispered, the sound harsh in the reverent silence. The maid started, looking up in confusion at the scullery girl standing where she didn't belong. "Please, it is only willow tea. My grandmother used it for fevers. It cannot hurt him now." Martha looked at the pale, wasted face of the Viscount, then back at Loveday. Desperation breeds strange alliances. She nodded, stepping aside. Loveday approached the dead. Up close, Rupert looked less like a lord and more like a boy, his skin gray and dry as parchment. With infinite care, she slid her arm behind his neck, lifting him just enough to press the cup to his cracked lips. He was dead weight, but as the bitter amber liquid touched his tongue, a reflex kicked in. He swallowed. Once. Twice. Loveday poured the rest, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening before lowering him back onto the pillows. Then came the waiting. The silence stretched, agonizing and taut. Minutes bled into one another. Loveday retreated to the shadows, clutching the empty cup to her chest, her heart counting out the seconds. Suddenly, a gasp tore through the room. Rupert's back arched off the mattress. Martha stifled a scream, but Loveday watched, transfixed. The dry, burning heat radiating from the bed abruptly shattered. A sheen of perspiration broke out across the Viscount's forehead, soaking his hairline, then his nightshirt. The fever, impenetrable for weeks, had broken. His chest heaved, not with the death rattle, but with deep, greedy draughts of air. "Father?" The word was a croak, barely audible, but it stopped the pacing in the hallway instantly. The door flew open. The Duke rushed in, falling to his knees beside the bed as Rupert's eyelids fluttered and opened, revealing eyes that were no longer clouded with delirium, but clear. "My boy," the Duke wept, burying his face in the sheets. "A miracle, a true miracle." Martha was sobbing with relief, pointing a trembling finger at Loveday in the corner. "It is her, your grace. She gave him a tea and he woke. She saved him." The Duke's head snapped up. The tears on his cheeks had not yet dried, but the light in his eyes shifted instantly from gratitude to a cold, razor-sharp suspicion. He looked at his son, alive and breathing, and then his gaze crawled across the room to the scullery maid shrinking against the velvet wallpaper. He rose slowly to his full height, towering over the room. He stared up the dregs and the china cup she held. "The finest doctors in England could do nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet rumble. "And yet a scullery maid with a cup of dirty water commands life to return." He took a step toward her. "How?" Loveday gripped the cup until her knuckles turned white, the warmth of the miracle draining away to leave her cold. She realized then that in this house, defying death was a sin equal to murder. The initial wave of relief that swept through Grimsway Hall was shallow and fleeting. By evening, it had receded, leaving behind the cold, wet sludge of suspicion. The miracle was too swift, too absolute. It defied the natural order. In the drawing room, Rupert's fiancée, Miss Cressida Langton, was the first to give the fear a voice. She was a woman carved from ice, her ambition a sharp, cutting edge hidden beneath layers of silk. Taking the Duke's arm, her voice was a conspiratorial whisper. "It is a blessing, of course, Your Grace, but unsettling. 20 learned men failed. How can a scullery girl succeed in minutes? Only the dark arts work with such unnatural speed." Her words were poison, perfectly administered. They found fertile ground in the Duke's mind, which was already haunted by a deep-seated childhood terror of divine judgment. He began to see not a cure, but a stain upon his house, a debt owed to some unholy power. Below stairs, the story twisted and grew monstrous with each retelling. The simple cup of willow tea became a witch's brew. Loveday's quiet confidence was remembered as a sinister calm. Servants who had known her for years as a harmless, hard-working girl now recalled strange habits, the herbs she kept, the way she sometimes hummed old Cornish tunes. Fear is a contagion, and soon the entire household was infected. The girl who had saved the heir was no longer a hero, she was a threat. By nightfall, Loveday was taken from the scullery, not with thanks, but with the firm grip of the head butler on her arm. She was led up countless flights of stairs to a small, cold attic room, the door locked behind her. She was to be confined for questioning. As Loveday sits alone in the cold attic, waiting for judgment, she thinks of all the stories her grandmother never got to finish telling, stories that will die with her if no one remembers. If this tale moves you even a little, hit subscribe now. Don't let stories like hers vanish. And if you won't subscribe, please tell me in the comments why, so I know what I'm doing wrong. For 2 days she shivered in the dark, fed only bread and water. The quiet was broken on the 3rd morning by the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots. The door was thrown open. The Duke stood there, his face a mask of righteous fury, and behind him stood the local magistrate. The butler held a set of iron chains. Loveday was dragged from the room, her wrists shackled, her simple act of kindness now recast as a pact with the devil. What evidence could possibly condemn her? The makeshift tribunal was held in the library, a room lined with leather-bound books that celebrated reason, yet the proceedings within were a descent into madness. Loveday stood before the heavy mahogany desk, the chains on her wrists chinking softly in the terrified silence. The magistrate sat at the center, flanked by the very physicians who had failed to save the heir. To admit that a scullery maid had succeeded where their science had failed was an indignity they could not swallow. To label it witchcraft was their only salvation. "It is a physiological impossibility," the lead physician declared, smoothing his whiskers with a trembling hand. "No botanical agent known to man breaks a fever of such magnitude in mere moments. The recovery was not biological, it was unnatural." The Duke, standing by the fireplace, stepped forward. In his hand, he held a small wooden box taken from Loveday's meager belongings. He upended it, and a shriveled, twisted object fell onto the table. It was a dried mandrake root, a harmless keepsake Loveday had kept because its gnarled shape reminded her of her grandmother's garden. But in the dim light of a library, under the Duke's accusatory finger, it looked like a grotesque effigy. "A poppet," the Duke spat, his voice trembling with righteous horror. "A totem to bind life and death. She kept this beneath the very roof where my son lay dying." Then came the final betrayal. Cressida Langton, dressed in mourning black as if the heir were already dead, pressed a lace handkerchief to dry eyes. "I did not wish to speak," she lied, her voice quavering with theatrical fear. "But I heard her in the scullery. She boasted that she could trade a soul for a soul. She said the Viscount would live, but he would belong to the shadows thereafter. "Lies!" The cry came from the chaise lounge in the corner. Viscount Rupert, pale as a spirit and wrapped in heavy blankets, struggled to sit up. His voice was weak, a reed in a gale, but desperate. "She showed me only kindness. It was tea, father, bitter tea. She saved me." "Silence!" the Duke roared, turning on his son with a terrifying mix of love and fanaticism. "You are under her thrall even now, Rupert. The demon clouds your mind. We must break the hold to save your immortal soul." The magistrate did not need further convincing. The pride of the doctors, the testimony of a lady, and the fear of a father had sealed the verdict before Loveday had even entered the room. "Loveday Chenoweth," he intoned, "you are found guilty of consorting with dark powers. To purge this evil from Grimsway Hall, you shall be committed to the flames at dawn." As the guards seized her arms, rough and uncaring, Loveday did not scream. She looked only at Rupert. The Viscount, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that defied his weakness, clawed at the arm of his chair. His legs, unused for weeks, shook violently as he forced himself to stand. He took one stumbling step, then another, his hand outstretched toward her as she was dragged toward the door. Would his strength hold long enough to reach her, or was he watching his savior vanish into the dark for the last time? The village green, usually a place of market stalls and maypoles, had been transformed into a theater of cruelty. A heavy wooden stake had been driven into the earth, piled high with faggots of dry brush and oil-soaked straw. The crowd that gathered was a fractured beast. Some villagers, who remembered Loveday sharing her bread or tending their scraped knees, wept in silent huddles. Others, whipped into a frenzy by the terrifying rumors drifting down from the hall, bayed for blood, their eyes wide with the superstitious terror that the Duke had stoked. Loveday was led to the wood, her head held high, though her legs trembled. She was bound to the stake, the rough hemp rope biting into her wrists. Just as the executioner raised his torch, a carriage careened to a halt at the edge of the crowd. Viscount Rupert stumbled out, supported by a footman, but fueled by a desperate, frantic strength. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He broke free from the servant and staggered into the open space between the mob and the pyre. He held up the very strip of bark he had retrieved from the sick-room floor. "Look at this! It is not a charm. It is willow, white willow from the riverbank." He turned to his father, who sat atop his black stallion, watching with an expression of granite. "Father, please, it is nature, not magic. The apothecaries know it. The bitterness in the wood cools the blood. It is a medicine of the earth, nothing more. Decades from now, men will call this science, and you will be called a murderer." The crowd quieted, murmuring. The logic pierced the hysteria for a heartbeat. The Duke's horse shifted uneasily. For a moment, Reginald Hawthorne hesitated. He looked at the simple wood in his son's hand, proof that folk wisdom was merely science his high-born mind could not yet grasp. But then he looked at the crowd. To back down now would be to admit he had been terrified of a twig. It would show weakness, and to the Duke, weakness was a sin greater than cruelty. "The devil hides in simple things to mock God," the Duke declared, his voice booming over the square. "Light the fire." Rupert lunged forward, but guards seized him, holding him back as he thrashed and wept. The torch touched the oil. A whoosh of air sucked the oxygen from the square as the flames leaped up, hungry and bright. Through the rising curtain of gray smoke, Loveday did not look at the fire. She found Rupert's eyes. She saw his agony, his guilt, the life she had bought him at the cost of her own. As the heat began to curl the edges of her apron, she did not scream a curse. She leaned forward against the ropes, her voice carrying strangely clear over the roar of the fire. "Do not weep, my lord," she said, her gaze locking onto his soul. "Fire only burns the body. It is the silence that burns the truth." The smoke cleared, but the shadow it cast over Grimsway Hall would never lift. Loveday died not with a scream of vengeance, but with a prayer on her lips, her final breath a forgiveness that scorched the Duke's soul far worse than any curse. When the ropes finally turned to ash and her body slumped, Viscount Rupert did not scream. He simply collapsed, his knees hitting the scorched earth with a finality that signaled the end of his youth. He was carried back to the hall, a man hollowed out by the justice of his father, alive only because a girl had died to make him so. Reginald Hawthorne, the Duke, lived for another decade, but he never truly spoke again. He spent his twilight years sitting in the high-backed chair of the library, staring obsessively into the hearth. He became a prisoner of his own making, terrified of the shapes he saw dancing in the embers, unable to warm himself by a fire without smelling the burning of innocence. The silence of the hall became his tomb long before he was ever buried. Rupert, upon inheriting the title, became a recluse to high society, but a savior to science. He poured the vast Hawthorne fortune not into grand balls or fox hunts, but into laboratories and universities. He anonymously funded the research of botanists and chemists, men who looked to the earth for answers, just as Loveday had. He built a quiet legacy on the foundation of a Scullery Maid's wisdom, ensuring that the witchcraft that saved him was eventually recognized as medicine. Rupert spent 50 years trying to wash the blood from his inheritance, but he learned the hardest lesson of all. Some wrongs can never be undone, only remembered. If Loveday's quiet courage touched you, do not let her story fade into the dark. Subscribe now. Do not wait until regret burns like those flames to value the stories that matter. And if you choose to walk away, please tell me in the comments why. I genuinely wish to understand the silence. It would be decades before Felix Hoffmann, a chemist at Bayer, formally synthesized acetyl salicylic acid, aspirin, from the same compounds found in the willow bark Loveday had used. Her magic would go on to save millions from pain and fever, a bitter, beautiful proof that the world eventually catches up to the truth. Science vindicated the Scullery Maid, teaching a tragic, eternal lesson that the knowledge we fear the most is often the very thing we need to survive.